50 years ago, on the 20th of January 1931, Julia Wallace was brutally murdered at her home in Anfield. Her husband, William Herbert Wallace, an insurance agent, was arrested, charged with her killing, tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang. But then he was reprieved by a unique reversal of the jury's verdict by the Court of Criminal Appeal. It's Merseyside's most famous murder case, and when Radio City first broadcast its own investigation 5 weeks ago, it rekindled the fierce controversy that raged at the time. Did Wallace cheat the gallows, or was there another man in the shadows at 29 Wolverton Street on that terrible night 50 years ago? There has now been a dramatic new development in the Wallace mystery, which we will reveal for the first time at 6:30 on Thursday evening, in a programme called Conspiracy of Silence. But to set the scene for this new evidence, we are presenting again, in 2 parts, our original investigation of the killing of Julia Wallace. It's a story told partly through dramatic reconstruction, but perhaps more vividly by men and women still alive today, who, 50 years ago, played their own real-life parts in this intriguing murder mystery. Roger Wilkes presents part 1 of our investigation of the mystery of Who Killed Julia?
A rain-swept mountainside high in the hills of North Wales. This is not where our tale begins, but where it ends, because the final scene in the Wallace case was played out here in a cottage some 60 miles from Liverpool one night in April 1980. A police constable was summoned to the cottage by worried neighbours. Inside, he found an old man dead in bed. A post-mortem showed he'd died 2 days earlier from a heart attack. His death went largely unnoticed and totally unreported. His funeral, a few days later, was attended only by relatives and close friends. And yet, this man had once been the mystery suspect in the Wallace case, and named to the police by William Herbert Wallace himself. Whatever secrets this man had, he took with him to the grave. But there are those who believe that he was the man who killed Julia Wallace. We will hear from them later. Meanwhile, our story, and it is a fantastic story, begins in Liverpool some 24 hours before the murder on Monday, the 19th of January, 1931.
The scene is the meeting place of the Liverpool Central Chess Club, a cafe in the basement of number 24 North John Street. The club captain, Mr. Samuel Beattie, is already setting the boards and pieces for the evening's tournament. In the corner at the foot of the stairs stands a telephone kiosk. The time is 7:20. The phone rings. The waitress Gladys Harley answers it.
Hello, City Cafe.
AU Bank 3581.
Yes.
Anfield calling you. Hold the line.
Who's on the phone?
I don't know. Do you require this number?
Insert 2 pennies, caller.
Is that the Central Chess Club?
Yes.
Is Mr. Wallace there?
Oh, hold on, I'll find out for you. Mr. Beattie?
Yes?
There's someone on the phone wanting to speak to Mr. Wallace.
Well, he's not here yet. He's down to play a match, so he might be along later.
So what'll I tell this gentleman who wants to speak to him?
Oh, I suppose I'd better speak to him. Samuel Beattie, club captain here. Can I help you?
Is Mr. Wallace there?
No, I'm afraid not.
But he will be there.
I can't say. He may or may not. If he's coming, he'll be here shortly. I suggest you ring up later.
Oh, no, I can't. I'm too busy. I have my girl's 21st birthday on, and I want to do something for her in the way of his business. I want to see him, particularly. Will you ask him to call round to my place tomorrow evening at 7:30?
What name shall I say?
Quatro. R.M. Quatro.
I'd better write this down. Can you tell me how to spell it?
Qualtrough. Quatro. And the address is 25 Menlove Gardens, East.
Right, so it's R.M. Quatro, 25 Menlove Gardens, East, at 7:30 tomorrow. And I'll give him your message, Mr. Quatro.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
The man who's just left the message for Mr. Wallace is no ordinary man. Mr. R.M. Quatro, whoever he may be, is the man who the following night will murder Julia Wallace. That fact will not be disputed. We'll also establish that the mysterious Mr. Quatro is calling from a telephone box in Anfield, 4 miles from the City Cafe and just 400 yards from Mr. Wallace's house in Wolverton Street. We will learn this because the call was logged at the telephone exchange. Why? Let's ask the operator who connected the call from Anfield 1627 to Bank 3581. Then she was a girl of 20. Now aged 70, Lily Kelly lives in New York.
I remember it so well because of the difficulty the man had making the call. He pressed the wrong button and said, "Operator, I have pressed button A, but have not got my number yet." It was quite an ordinary male voice. There's nothing really unusual about it, but we heard that there had been a murder, and the police seemed to think that the telephone call was important.
Mr. Quatro rang off at about 24 minutes past 7 on the night of Monday, the 19th of January, 1931. By now the chess tournament is underway. At about 7:45, someone notices that Mr. Wallace has arrived. He's playing a match with Mr. McCartney.
Good evening, Mr. Wallace.
Hello, Mr. Beatty. How are you?
I've got a telephone message for you.
Oh, from whom?
Here, I've written it down. It's from a man called Quatro.
Quatro? Quatro? I don't know anybody named Quatro. Who is he?
Well, if you don't know him, I certainly don't. But he left this message for you. He wants you to call on him tomorrow evening at 7:30. Look, here's his address. Something in the nature of a business deal, I gather. He can't phone you later tonight because he's got his girl's 21st birthday party going on.
I don't know the chap at all. Where's Menlove Gardens East? Is it Menlove Avenue?
No, Menlove Gardens East.
I suppose I'll find it.
Oh, wait a minute. Mr. Days lives in that neighbourhood. He might be able to help you. I know one of the gardens comes into Menlove Avenue and another, I think, goes into Queen's Drive. Days will know.
Well, if you could ask him for me, Mr. Beatty, I'll just jot the name and address in my diary.
It's not much help, I'm afraid. But it's a bad place to be knocking about in after dark, you know, Mr. Wallace.
Oh, I belong to Liverpool, and I've got a tongue in my head. I'll find it. Come on, McCartney, your move.
It is raining on the morning of Tuesday, the 20th of January. William Herbert Wallace, in Mackintosh and bowler hat, is doing his rounds in Clubmoor. He is an insurance agent, known and respected, the man from the Prudential. He is tall, 52 years old, with a short greying moustache and steel-rimmed spectacles. He has been working this round for years and knows the district well. Joe Cleary, now Sir Joseph, then a young accountant's clerk, retains a vivid mental picture of him.
2 or 3 times a week, I would see Wallace, sometimes, not always, with his wife. He was a straight-backed man. He looked like an elongated walking stick. I never saw anybody talking to him or his wife. They both seemed to be old-fashioned, taciturn, never smiling. He was dressed in normal fashion, generally a long overcoat, and she, particularly old-fashioned, longish skirts and, you might call it a picture hat, one of those big hats the ladies wore at that time. In those days, murder was murder. It was a cause not only for concern, but you had reams in the papers, and it was a quiet, respectable area. The general opinion was, even before the case came into court in the first place, that he was guilty.
Mr. Wallace goes home for lunch as usual. When he arrives at number 29 Wolverton Street, the meal is already on the table. He greets his wife, Julia. She is also 52. They've been married for 17 years. They have no children. Over lunch, Mr. Wallace reminds Julia of his appointment that evening with Mr. Quatro. The afternoon has turned fine, so Mr. Wallace leaves his mackintosh hanging in the hall and puts on his overcoat. He goes back on his round. Despite the bitter weather, his clients find him his usual cheerful self. He returns home to Wolverton Street about 6:05.
You do think Pussy's safe, then?
Oh, yes, the cat'll be all right. Don't worry, Julia.
It's such nasty weather to be lost in, poor little thing.
He'll turn up. He knows when he's well off. You spoil him.
No, I don't. Do you think I do? Would you like another cup, Herbert, or have you finished?
No, I'd better be getting along to Mossley Hill. The sooner I go, the sooner I'll be back. Finding the place might be a bit of a problem, but well worth it in commission, I hope.
Did I tell you Amy has tickets for Mother Goose at the Empire? I don't know if I'll feel well enough by Friday. Between between ourselves, I'm not particular about going, but Amy can't take a hint. She's calling later in the week to see if the trip's on or off.
Well, my trip's definitely on, dear. But I'll be home as soon as I can.
What happens now is the crux of our story. What we know for certain is this, that a newspaper boy called at the house to deliver the Echo, that a milk boy delivered the evening milk, and that sometime before 9:15, Julia Wallace was attacked and savagely beaten to death. For the moment, let's not even guess at who the murderer was, because like Mr. Wallace, we have an appointment in Menlove Gardens East with Mr. Quatro. At 7:06, Mr. Wallace is over 2 miles from Wolverton Street, waiting for a tram at the junction of Smithdown Road and Lodge Lane. He takes the first tram that comes along, intending to change at Penny Lane. He tells the conductor he has an important call to make in Menlove Gardens East. In the course of the next 50 minutes, Mr. Wallace will give 10 people this information, a fact the police were later to consider highly suspicious. Was Wallace deliberately drawing attention to himself, carefully providing himself with an alibi?
I walked up Menlove Gardens West, turned into Menlove Gardens North, and being uncertain as to where Menlove Gardens East was, I decided to ask the first person I met. A woman who came out of one of the houses in Menlove Gardens North suggested it might be along the road in continuation of Menlove Gardens West.
PC James Sargent is making his duty round from Allerton Police Station.
Excuse me, officer, but do you know of Menlove Gardens East?
There's no such place. But there's a Menlove Gardens North, South and West.
I've been to Menlove Gardens West. Now, the person I'm looking for doesn't live there, and the numbers in Menlove Gardens North and South are all even. You see, I'm an agent for the Prudential Assurance Company, and a Mr. Quatro rang up my club last night and left a message asking me to call at 25 Menlove Gardens East.
I don't know anybody of that name in the district, sir. But if I knew, I'd try 25 Menlove Avenue.
But is there anywhere where I can see a directory?
Well, there's the post office in Allerton Road. If you don't see one down there, you might be allowed to look at the directory at the police station.
Thank you, officer. Oh, will the post office still be open? No, it's not 8 o'clock yet, is it? No, it's just 1:45.
I'll check that for you, sir. Yes, I'll make it 8:45 on my watch, too.
Well, thank you again, officer. Good night.
Mr. Wallace has now spent a good half hour looking for Mr. Quatro. The post office doesn't have a street directory, and he crosses the road to a newsagent's. The woman behind the counter shows him a directory which confirms what he's already been told. There is no such person as R.M. Quatro, and no such place as Menlove Gardens East. Only at that point, at a few minutes to 8, does Mr. Wallace give up his search for a man unborn, a house unbuilt, and a street that never was. By 9:15, Mr. Wallace is back at Wolverton Street. He has been unable to get into the house. His neighbours from number 31, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, who are going out for the evening, find him in the back alley trying the yard door.
Good evening, Mr. Wallace.
Have you heard anything unusual tonight?
Why?
What's happened? I've been out since 7:15. I've just got back, but I can't get in. The front door's locked. I've been to the front and the back.
You've already tried the back kitchen door?
Yes, I can't open it.
Well, that's funny. I'll try it again and we'll wait.
I can't understand it. She won't be out. She has such a bad cold. It opens now.
Well, we'll stop here while you have a look round.
Julia? Julia?
They wait a minute or two, watching the gaslights being turned up by Wallace as he calls out his wife's name. Why hadn't he called out at first when he found the door so strangely locked against him? To strengthen his alibi, had he, as the police would suggest, deliberately waited to meet somebody who would witness his entering of the house?
Come and see. She's been killed.
There is a moment of silence. Then the Johnsons run into the yard and follow Mr. Wallace into the house, into the front parlour. Across the black rug in front of the fireplace lies the body of Julia Wallace. Her battered head is haloed by a huge oval of blood. A massive wound on the left temple reveals bone and brains. Everywhere in this tiny, cluttered room there is blood, some has splashed to a height of 7 feet. Her dead eyes are staring at the pedals of the piano.
Jesus Christ!
They've finished her.
Oh, you poor darling.
Is she cold?
No.
Oh, don't disturb anything. I'm going for the police.
Yes. And a doctor. But I don't think it's much use. They've finished her.
Any particular doctor?
The nearest one.
Right. I'll be as quick as I can.
They've finished her. Look at the brains. Whatever have they used?
I don't know. I can't see any.
Whatever was she doing with the Macintosh? And my Macintosh. Look, it's tucked under her shoulder here.
Is it your Macintosh?
Yes, it's mine.
Come on, love. Let's go into the kitchen. I'll build a fire up and make us a cup of tea.
The kitchen is the room in which the Wallaces spent their evenings. The front parlour was used mainly for visitors, or for the couple's musical evenings, when Mr. Wallace would play his violin and Julia would accompany on the piano. A copy of that night's Liverpool Echo is spread out across the kitchen table, open at the centre pages. On an upright chair is Julia's handbag. On a shelf to the left of the kitchen range is a microscope Mr. Wallace uses in his amateur laboratory upstairs, a box of chessmen, some books, and a homemade cabinet containing some photographic equipment. The door of this cabinet has been wrenched off and is lying in 2 pieces on the floor.
What have they taken? Can you remember what was in it? Let's see. They've dropped some coins.
Those must have come from the cash box on the shelf up at the top.
Oh.
I'll just have a look. I can't tell for certain until I've checked my books, but I think it's about £4.
Oh.
Upstairs, Mr. Wallace finds 5 £1 notes apparently untouched in a jar in one of the bedrooms. 9:10, and the police have arrived. Back in the kitchen, Mrs. Johnson has made up the fire and is comforting Mr. Wallace, now slumped in a chair, sobbing.
In 1931, the Liverpool City Police Force was in pretty poor shape.
Author and criminologist Jonathan Goodman.
The reason could be traced back to 1919 and the progress of the police bill through Parliament. The police union, threatened with disbandment, called for a nationwide strike. Throughout most of the country, the call was ignored. But in Liverpool, more than half the members of the force came out. The Watch Committee issued a statement saying that all strikers would be dismissed, and 951 members of a force of 1,874 remained on strike and were dismissed. Recruitment began. Within a fortnight, over 500 men were sworn in. Some were of excellent character, others were not. By 1931, much of the Liverpool City Police Force was hardly up to the task of dealing with parking offences, let alone a full-scale murder investigation.
Come inside, officer. Something terrible's happened.
Mind the cap. Don't let it go into the front room.
He's run straight through into the kitchen.
Excuse me, sir.
Accompanied by Mr. Wallace, whom he later describes as being extraordinarily cool and calm, P.C. Williams examines the body, then searches first the parlour and then the rest of the house. He finds no trace of the murder weapon. In the middle upstairs bedroom, they find that roll of £1 notes, apparently untouched. At 10:10, another arrival at 29 Wolverton Street. Professor McFall, honorary medical advisor to the Liverpool CID, who at once sets about his gruesome task of conducting the medical examination. Home Office pathologist Dr. Charles St. Hill is critical of the methods employed.
Now, McFall's responsibilities, when he came to the scene of the crime, were to determine, first of all, how death occurred, when death occurred, and to make observations which might help to determine who was responsible. The important point in this particular case was when death occurred. For some reason, McFall only concentrated on the progress of rigor mortis and did not take any body temperatures. It may be he'd lost or broken his thermometer, and of course in those days they weren't too easy to replace. It may be he didn't want to disturb the body, but by not taking the temperature, he didn't carry out the least inaccurate method of determining time since death. Now, rigor mortis can start between 2 and 6 hours after death. McFall observed when he first came to see the body that rigor mortis was just commencing. At first, he said that this indicated that death had occurred some 2 hours prior to his arrival, and this, in fact, would, of course, put the time of death some 50 minutes after, or possibly even an hour, after Wallace was known to have left the house. Later on, he increased this time of death to some 4 hours prior to his arrival, which would have put the time of death when Wallace was still there. In other words, he changed his mind and then gave an accuracy of time since death based entirely on the observation of rigor mortis, very accurately, far more accurately than I think is justifiable.
At 10:05, the head of Liverpool CID, Detective Superintendent Hubert Moore, arrives. Jonathan Goodman, who's made an exhaustive study of the Wallace case, assesses him bluntly.
Moore was one of the men whose rapid rise through the ranks of the Liverpool CID was due very largely to the state of the force following the police strike. Lacking in imagination and humour, he was an able policeman, but by no means a brilliant detective. Soon after the strike, he was made an inspector in the Special Branch, and at the beginning of 1930, he was promoted to the rank of superintendent. At the end of the year, only a matter of weeks before the Wallace case, he was put in charge of the CID. The killing of Julia Wallace provided the greatest challenge of his career. He had to prove his detractors wrong. He had to make an arrest.
While Mr. Wallace is being questioned about his version of the events, upstairs, Professor McFall is doing some investigating of his own. At 11 o'clock, he makes an interesting discovery in the bathroom. On the rim of the lavatory pan, at the front, and slightly to the right, is a blood clot. A tiny one, measuring just 3/16 of an inch in diameter and 1/8 of an inch in height.
It had a rather curious shape. It was a little pyramid, but the observation of this clot of blood made him think that the assailant had gone upstairs to try and wash all the blood off his hands and clothes and legs and so on. There was no other blood visible in the room, and widespread and extensive chemical tests were done to see if they could detect blood having been washed down the drain. The test they used was an extremely sensitive one known as the benzodine test, which will detect blood in dilutions of 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million. So it was an extremely sensitive test. And had blood been there, they should have found it. In fact, they found none.
Sometime after 11 o'clock, Superintendent Moore decides it's time for Mr. Wallace to make a full and detailed statement about the evening's events. Mr. Wallace agrees to this, but as he's hustled into a waiting police car, a crowd of onlookers is buzzing with the rumour that he's been arrested. One version has it that Mr. Wallace has confessed to the killing, but of course he's done no such thing. At Anfield Detective Office, Mr. Wallace volunteers a full statement. In it, he relates his fruitless search for Mr. Quatro, and for the first time fixes the time at which he claimed he'd left home, leaving his wife alive and well. It was, he said, 6:45. He spends the night at the home of his sister-in-law. All over Liverpool, a search is underway for a blood-stained man. But Tuesday night becomes Wednesday morning, and already the trail leading to the elusive Mr. Quatro is going cold.
They seek an ear, they seek an ear. Is he alive? Do you know? Either in hell or the prudential, that old elusive Quatro.
The whole of Liverpool is talking about the murder. At police headquarters in Dale Street, Superintendent Moore calls a conference of CID officers. At Princess Dock Mortuary, Professor McFall performs the post-mortem examination. Death, he concludes, was due to a fracture of the skull by someone striking the deceased 11 times upon the head with terrific force. Detective Sergeant Harry Bailey takes up Mr. Wallace's search for Mr. Quatro, and although there are 14 families of that name living in Liverpool, none can throw any light at all upon the mysterious telephone call. Jonathan Goodman.
From the start of the investigation, it had been clear that whoever made the telephone call was the same person who the following night murdered Mrs. Wallace. But was this person someone who had conceived the idea of the bogus message as a means of luring Wallace away so as to leave Julia alone and unprotected in the house? Or was it Wallace himself who made the call as a prelude to a cunningly contrived alibi?
Aware he is a suspect, Wallace has his own ideas about the caller. He makes another statement to the police, giving them the names of people Julia would have admitted to the house. This list includes somebody with a possible grudge against him. Wallace has named the man he believes killed Julia. But, for reasons best known to themselves, the police do not choose to pursue the matter.
Wallace's story was that he had left home at about 7:15 on Monday evening, the night before the murder, and walked to the junction of Breck Road and Belmont Road, where he had boarded a tram to North John Street. but there was no one to substantiate this statement. Superintendent Moore pointed out that Wallace could just as easily have left home 3 or 4 minutes earlier than the time he stated, and made his way to the telephone box. After making the call to the city cafe, he could have boarded a tram at a stop only 25 yards away. It's worth noting that although the police made great efforts to trace the conductors of the trams which Wallace used on his journey to Menlove Gardens, they made no attempt whatever to trace the conductor of the tram that took him to the vicinity of the city cafe. There seems to be only one explanation for this. Moore realized that if the conductor were traced, his evidence as to the time of the tram's departure from Breck Road would either partially confirm or completely demolish the theory that Wallace made the phone call. If the theory were demolished, then the whole case against Wallace would be demolished too. Moore decided to play it safe. An unconfirmed theory was better than no theory at all. No case.
The timing of Wallace's movements on the night of the murder is also crucial. We know the evening paper and the milk were delivered. The question is, when was Julia Wallace last seen alive, and did Wallace have time to commit the crime? We have traced some of the young people who made deliveries in that area. Douglas Metcalfe and Harold Jones, now in their 60s, remember.
I used to deliver the Financial Times and the Armchair Scientist to Mr. Wallace. The Financial Times would be every day. On that particular night, Alan Close was either approaching or leaving 29 Wolverton Street. Alison Wildman was coming into Wolverton Street from the entry leading from Redbourne Street.
I was 14 years old and used to deliver newspapers. On the night following the Wallace murder, Douglas Metcalfe, who worked for the same firm, was my close friend, asked me if I would go round with him on his round, which was later than mine. And when we arrived in Richmond Park, we met Alan Close and Elsie Wright. We were discussing the Wallace murder the previous night, and Alan said, "Oh, I saw Mrs. Wallace last night. She took the milk in for me."
We persuaded him to go along and tell the police. And I went with him to the police. Didn't actually stand on the step with him, but I stood by the door sort of thing. And he told the police that he saw Mrs. Wallace alive at 7:15, and I heard him say so. It was only later that I discovered that Alan had been persuaded by the police to change the time, and this was because, according to Alan, that when he went into the house, the police started questioning him about the correct time. And Alan said it was about 7:15. So several comments were passed by the police, and they said, well, if you're not sure that it was 7:15, it could have been 7:25. And Alan said that he changed his mind and made it 7:25. This is what Alan told me later on. I'm quite sure it was 7:15. Within a minute or two, because I'd been to the church hall and checked the time with the caretaker at the hall, and I occasionally used to take a paper up to him at night. Alan Close was quite sure it was Mrs. Wallace that opened the door to him. I can't see how anybody, particularly a young lad of 14, could be deceived.
The significance of Alan Close's story can't be overemphasized. If, as he said, he was delivering milk to Mrs. Wallace at 7:15, and if, as Mr. Wallace claimed, he'd left home at about that time on his journey to Menlove Avenue, then it would have been impossible for Mr. Wallace to have been the murderer. Superintendent Moore is discussing the case with colleagues when the message about Close's evidence is phoned through to headquarters. Moore, in turn, rings Professor McFall, who is totally incredulous. He, of course, has firmly fixed the time of death as no later than 6 o'clock. So, Superintendent Moore is faced with a dilemma. If the professor is right, then Mr. Wallace could not be the murderer, since he didn't get home from his insurance round till turn 6. If, on the other hand, what Alan Close says is true, and if Mr. Wallace did in fact leave home at the time he says he did, then the murder must have been committed after Mr. Wallace's departure from Menlove Gardens. As Moore pondered this problem aloud, a young detective suggests they better start looking for another suspect. For a moment there is absolute silence. Then very quietly Moore speaks. "No," he says, "the milk boy must be mistaken." For the next 11 days, Superintendent Moore and his team work hard assembling a case against William Herbert Wallace. Mr. Wallace knows he's the prime suspect. He knows that the police have assigned a plainclothes officer to shadow him. He probably doesn't know that the local papers have had the same idea. The man from the Liverpool Evening Express, who was ordered to tail Mr. Wallace, was Bill Rogers.
I followed Wallace for only one day, and this particular day he called at the office of the insurance company where he was employed in Dale Street, and I wasn't far behind, and he entered the office and was in there some time, and I waited, and when he came out, I had been joined by a photographer who was standing behind me. Wallace stood on the top step of the office and looked up and down the street, and I heard a voice behind me say, "Lift your arm, Bill." So I did, and faint click, and where was Wallace photographed? And that was the photograph used for many years. He was standing there with his bowler hat on, the cigarette between his lips. He looked quite carefree, actually. And I think it was either the same day or the next day that Chief Superintendent Hubert Moore, in charge of the CID, rang through to my chief, the late Harold Sanders, and said, "You've got a man following Wallace. Call him off." There was some hoo-ha, and eventually my boss agreed to call me off if Hubert Moore would give him the tip, if and when Wallace was arrested.
So Bill Rogers is taken off the story. He, like the other Liverpool reporters, has to be content with the crumbs of information thrown out by the CID.
Liverpool Echo, Tuesday, the 27th of January. It is now a week since the city was startled by the brutal murder of Mrs. Wallace. And although the police have garnered a great mass of evidence, no vital clue has yet been discovered.
It's beginning to seem to the people of Liverpool that the police have not the faintest sniff of a suspect. William Herbert Wallace, meanwhile, knowing perfectly well that not only is he a suspect, but the only suspect, is kept in touch with developments during his daily visits to the Dale Street Police headquarters.
Liverpool Daily Post and Mercury, Thursday, the 29th of January. The Daily Post understands that a dramatic move may be made by the Liverpool police after an important conference this morning.
It's clear that the Daily Post means an arrest is imminent. In fact, it isn't until after dark on the following Monday, the 2nd of February, that the dramatic move is made. At 7 o'clock that night, 13 days after the murder, a police car draws up outside number 83 Allett Road. Out steps Superintendent Moore and 2 detectives. All 3 walk up the stairs to the first-floor flat, the home of Mr. Wallace's sister-in-law. She is out, but Mr. Wallace is in the living room, answering letters of condolence. When charged, he replies,
"What can I say? In answer to a charge of which I am absolutely innocent."
Later, after delivering Wallace to the main Bridewell, Superintendent Moore walks to one of his favourite pubs and stays there, celebrating until closing time. The next day, Wallace appears for the first time in court. The public gallery is packed. The charge is read, then the prosecuting solicitor, Mr. J.R. Bishop, rises to outline the case against Wallace. His speech, reported in both the Liverpool evening papers and read by thousands all over Merseyside, including southwest Lancashire, from where the jury at the subsequent trial will be picked, his speech is nothing short of astonishing. Author Jonathan Goodman.
As prosecuting solicitor, Bishop should have presented a dispassionate summary of the evidence which suggested Wallace's guilt, together with such comments as he thought fair. But his opening speech contained 18 misstatements of fact, sufficient surely to warrant its place in the Guinness Book of Records.
Mr. Bishop successfully applies for Wallace to be remanded in custody for 8 days, and the prisoner is led out of the dock. But before being driven to Walton Jail, he's allowed to telephone a solicitor. He chooses Hector Munro. Though now a very old man, he still remembers the case clearly.
I didn't actually know Wallace, but he knew me by sight. And I suppose that when he was charged with the murder, he thought that I had been the person that could deal with the case for him. I thought that the absence of proof was conclusive in his favour, that the evidence wasn't anything like enough to convict.
Hector Munro loses no time. After reading a copy of Bishop's extraordinary speech, he visits Wallace in Walton, then drives to the scene of the crime. At once, Munro grasps the importance of the time factor and quickly tracks down the children to whom Alan Close, the milk boy, had spoken the day after the murder. Munro traces Alison Wildman, then age 16, who had a part-time job delivering newspapers.
They came up in great haste to interview me,
and the three solicitors walked with me around my paper round and timed everything. The time was 23 minutes to 7. Alan Close was on the doorstep of 29 Wolverton Street. He was delivering milk and was waiting for the can to be returned to him. When they had satisfied themselves that the time which I had stated was perfectly correct, they then informed the police of my evidence, and an Inspector Gold came and interviewed me, and I told him the same thing.
Hector Munro is encouraged. He now has evidence to suggest that Mrs. Wallace was alive at 7:15. But Munro is less pleased with the way the police are putting their case together. He discovers that although the police have taken statements from both Alison Wildman and another newspaper boy who pushed an echo through the letterbox at about 6:35, neither is to be called to give evidence. The committal proceedings against Wallace begin on Thursday the 19th of February and last for 7 days. At the end of that time, the magistrate invites Wallace to say his piece.
I plead not guilty to the charge made against me, and I am advised to reserve my defence. I would like to say that my wife and I lived together on the very happiest terms during the period of some 18 years of our married life. Our relations were of complete confidence in and affection for each other. The suggestion that I murdered my wife is monstrous. That I should attack and kill her is, to all who know me, unthinkable, and the more so when it must be realised that I could not possibly obtain one advantage by committing such a deed. Nor do the police suggest that I gained any advantage. On the contrary, in actual fact, I have lost a devoted and loving comrade. My home life is completely broken up, and everything that I hold dear has been ruthlessly parted and torn from me. I am now to face the torture of this nerve-wracking ordeal. I protest once more that I am entirely innocent of this terrible crime.
Wallace sits down, and the magistrate commits him for trial at the Liverpool Spring Assizes. In the gallery, someone lets out a cheer. 7 weeks later, on Wednesday the 22nd of April 1931, the trial of William Herbert Wallace on a charge of wilful murder opens.
That was part 1 of Radio City's investigation into the murder of Julia Wallace, first broadcast 5 weeks ago. You can hear part 2, A Tale of Two Suspects, at 6:30 tomorrow evening. The dramatic new evidence we have uncovered will be revealed at 6:30 on Thursday evening in a programme called Conspiracy of Silence.